I'm Liz Humes. Michelangelo is one of the greatest artists of all time. He's also the best documented artist of the early modern era. 1,400 letters written by him and to him still exist. More than 300 pages of his personal and professional records remain, 300 poems, 600 drawings, and then there are the finished and unfinished sculptures, paintings, and architecture. Even his bank records and contracts survived. Most biographies about him idolize and idealize the artist. Most of them end at the completion of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo lived for another 52 years. William Wallace is an internationally recognized expert on Michelangelo. He's written more than 80 essays, chapters, and articles, and is the author and editor of 6 different books on Michelangelo. His vivid biography, Michelangelo, the Artist, the Man, and His Times, published in 2010, paints a vibrant and fresh portrait of the man. The book draws from new scholarship and primary sources and from the points of view of family, friends, and patrons. In this next lecture, Wallace will speak about the challenges and excitement of writing a modern biography of the famous Renaissance artist. And now, William Wallace.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first visit to Fredericksburg, but one of my favorite people in graduate school graduated from Mary Washington, and since she's so smart, I've always wanted to come visit the campus, and now today it finally turned nice, and it was a lovely visit on the campus as well. So I'm very honored to be here and very happy to be speaking to you. I'd like to talk to you about writing a biography of Michelangelo. And as Bill mentioned already, most people, when I mentioned writing a biography of Michelangelo, when I was thinking about writing a biography of Michelangelo, said, isn't there the Agony and the Ecstasy? And the Agony and the Ecstasy is a very good book, and I still recommend it to my students or to first-time visitors to Italy. But the Agony and the Ecstasy is a novel, and a biography does purport to be telling the truth. And they are slightly different. But I actually think that the Agony and the Ecstasy, the success of the Agony and the Ecstasy has kept people from writing biographies of Michelangelo. It has been assumed that there must be lots of biographies. But the truth is, the last really, truly great biography of Michelangelo was written more than 100 years ago by an English Victorian gentleman, John Addington Symonds, and it still is an excellent biography. But in 100 years, I think we ask very different questions now. We're very interested in different aspects of people's lives. I would say, in contrast, the Victorians were much more interested in the personal life. John Addington Symonds wrote at the time when you wrote great men biography, and this was still Michelangelo, the isolated genius view of Michelangelo, which is also part of the Agony and the Ecstasy. A man who couldn't get along with his family, who had very few friends, who was constantly struggling with popes. But I set out to really put Michelangelo back in his time and surround him with the 1,100 individuals who are named in his correspondence, the very extensive correspondence that we have still extant of Michelangelo. So not only do we ask different questions in the 21st century now, I think we're much more interested in sex and scandal than maybe the Victorians were. We're much more interested in the personal life and the connection between the personal individual and how he makes and does the sorts of things he does. What is the nature of the relationship between personality and creativity? And Michelangelo is a wonderful test case. I think do we have the lights go down just a little bit here on the screen? Also in 100 years, a lot of research has taken place. We have the complete correspondence now of Michelangelo available to us. And so we know just a lot more than was available to John Addington Symonds. And there's been, of course, a lot of scholarship in the last 100 years. For example, the doctors have become very interested in Michelangelo. But everybody has become interested in Michelangelo. I don't think there's probably anybody in the audience who doesn't know something about Michelangelo. He's virtually ubiquitous in advertising and popular culture. And as I said, almost everybody has either read the book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, or seen a pretty poor movie with Charlton Heston and Rex Harrison, The Agony and the Ecstasy, but also recommended. But as I said, there's been a lot of research, and some of that research, some is better than other research, but the doctors have been very interested in trying to determine the nature of creativity and the functioning of the brain. There's been a lot of neuroscientific research on artistic creativity in the last couple of decades, I would say. In this example, the cover article for the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1990, this doctor associated this very, very famous scene of the creation of Adam, and looking very carefully at God the Father, determined that that is the outline of the human brain. Which is actually kind of an interesting idea if we start to think of God as all-knowing, as in the Greek sense of nous, an all-knowing being. On the other hand, a good idea sometimes spawns more ideas, not all of which are quite as good. For example, the cover article of Kidney International, one of those magazines I regularly read by my bedside. In 2000, and yes, you can guess, this doctor, who happens to be a kidney specialist, determined that the outline of God the Father, also from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, of him creating the waters, is really a cross-section of the kidney. Now, I suspect there are some doctors in the house. And if you are wondering, as a doctor, why the ureter is going in the wrong direction of the kidney, that is explained to us that that would be the position of the empty ureter if the kidney were hurled at the viewer, or traversing at high speed through space. So all I can say is the next time you visit the Sistine Chapel, watch out. Hurtling kidneys. And since 2000, 2 Brazilian doctors have found 47 other anatomical parts on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But we have to remember, the Sistine was not an anatomical theater. It's the center and the heart of Christianity. So there has been a lot of research in the last 100 years, and some is better than others, but fortunately I depended on some very, very good research on Michelangelo that has taken place in the last 100 years or so. I actually came to the idea of writing a biography from my very first book that I wrote on Michelangelo in 1994 about the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. This is the great Medici church across from their Medici Palace, and associated with the church was a facade that Michelangelo was supposed to create, which never got made, but then instead he built the Medici Chapel, and then alongside on the other side is the great Laurentian Library. These are 3 major architectural and sculptural projects that Michelangelo was engaged in for the Medici family over the course of 16 years that he was working at San Lorenzo. And my basic thesis in that book, and the basic new revelation that I found about Michelangelo, was how very successful he was at managing human talent. That he was a very successful businessman, even an entrepreneur. And I was able to document that he was organizing and directing up to 300 individuals simultaneously at work on these 3 simultaneously large and expensive projects. And this goes somewhat immediately contrary to the most received idea about Michelangelo, an artist who worked entirely by himself, who refused to have any kind of help, who could not get along with his assistants. Instead, I found out that he was an extremely efficient and well-directed businessman. And that was the only way that he was going to be able to carry out these really gigantic projects. And these are sculptures from that Medici Chapel, the Medici Chapel. So let's think about the Medici Chapel as an example of precisely how Michelangelo worked as a kind of director of a large workshop of very, very talented craftsmen who helped him to carry out these projects. Because if we look at the Medici Chapel here, Michelangelo designed everything. He even built the building. and everything in it is Michelangelo's design. But he actually himself only carved 7 of the most important figures. The 3 figures on each of the 2 tombs that are opposite one another, and then the Medici Madonna in the center. Everything else in this chapel is actually being carved by other people, people working under Michelangelo's direction. And for example, this wonderful tabernacle on the right-hand side, these over-door tabernacles, is exquisite marble work where Michelangelo is directing and designing every single facet, but he's not his hammer and chisel is not touching one single part of this tabernacle. And yet, it's an extremely beautifully worked object. This is marble carving that looks like woodwork. You can't do this in marble. You're not supposed to make marble look like boards nailed together to create this tabernacle. So this is really exquisite work that is being accomplished under Michelangelo's direction, even though he himself is perhaps not actually touching any one of these objects. And so that first book was about how precisely did Michelangelo direct that workshop. To what degree should we give authorship to somebody else rather than Michelangelo? Because we know there are 50 people just in that chapel alone carving tabernacles, etc. And here is a very specific example of precisely how Michelangelo directed the project. On the right-hand side is a piece of paper upside down. It's a leftover piece of paper that's been cut out, and I've reconstructed what it originally looked like. And what Michelangelo has done on the paper is draw this shape that's in black. And that's the shape of this volute in the Medici Chapel. After having cut out the shape on paper, he would translate that into tin or wood and what is called a template. And with a tin template, then, he can give that to the workers, and they can follow that as an example of precisely what they need to do. And there are 8 identical volutes in the Medici Chapel of people carving these volutes by identical designs according to the design of Michelangelo, even though he's not carving it. Then, after having cut out this shape from the paper, he used the leftover scrap of paper to record the names of 24 workers who were working with him in the chapel at the very beginning of the project in 1524. So it just happened to be a convenient piece of scrap paper so as to make sure that he was paying his workers by the end of the week. And that's the only reason this piece of paper even survived. Much of this would be just thrown away as part of the workshop detritus. But because Michelangelo wrote on it and dated it, somebody kept that piece of paper as worthwhile keeping. And so we have this tiny little glimpse, and this isn't the only one, but it's one example I'll give you, of precisely how Michelangelo was working and directing these individuals. And I know that these volutes are all of identical scale and precisely the size that is seen on this piece of paper, because as a younger person with more hair, I actually got up there and measured every one of them. But please don't tell everybody about my being in the Medici Chapel as a sculptor in one of the tabernacles. If you move ahead 1 year, exactly 1 year, we move from Michelangelo directing 24 people to more than 110. 110 listed twice each week. Michelangelo is writing down the names of every single one of his workers and how many days they're working and how much they're getting paid. Michelangelo was an A-type manager. He liked to keep control of everything he was doing, especially at the beginning of a project. At the beginning of a project, he wanted to know everything that was going on, and he kept records of everything that was going on. Just imagine this brilliant genius of an artist writing down 110 names every single day and recording them in order to have the payroll correct by the end of the week. And this actually, believe it or not, we have for the first year and a half of the project, Michelangelo keeping these lists for the whole first year and a half, in which point he finally turns over the bookkeeping to somebody else. And it's these lists that actually survived in the Italian archives, which began my project, because nobody was stupid enough, like me, to look at these lists and like, who are these people? I wanted to know who they were. And so I spent hours and hours trying to figure out who all the names of these people are on these lists, week after week after week. But the truth is, the Italians have not thrown away a piece of paper since 1100. And if you have enough patience, you can go to the archives and you can find these people. You can find out where they live. You can find out who their neighbors are. You can find out how much tax they paid or how much tax they weren't paying. You can find out all about the disputes they have with their neighbors, etc. And so while it was impossible to identify every single person on this list, it was easy enough to identify plenty to get a very clear picture of the kinds of people Michelangelo was working with. Since there are a dozen Giovannis and a dozen Pieros, and those are the two most common names in Renaissance Florence, it's kind of hard to separate one Giovanni from another. But what actually started to happen was I was able to identify plenty of these people on this list, far more than 60% of the people, and get them specifically down to learning something about their lives, about where they lived and who they were. And a couple of things revealed themselves to me. 75% of Michelangelo's workers come from the little towns of Settignano or Fiesole, which are the two hill towns just outside of Florence and the source for huge amounts of labor. These are the people who grow up as skilled masons, skilled stoneworkers. And these are the people that Michelangelo was hiring. But what was even more surprising, 50% of the names on this list are nicknames. Nicknames indicated to me that Michelangelo knows these people very, very well. He knows them by their nickname. And the nicknames themselves are somewhat autobiographical. There's the thief, the cat, the carrot, the priest, the Turk, the little mouse, and then my very favorite, the Antichrist. And so like any good historian, I began to imagine, what did the Antichrist say to the Turk? What did the thief say to the priest? And guess what? In those archives, when names were, especially for the workers' class, were not particularly, well remembered, most people went only by their first name. Most people actually went by their nicknames. So you could actually track down nicknames into the archives, including Antichrist, Anticristo. So this is actually where I began to fill out the sense of who these people were. And instead of getting 300 names, I was beginning to see a coalescing. There are about 6 large, interrelated clan families, all coming from these areas of Settignano and Fiesole. Michelangelo is not training these people. He's hiring people he already knows to be skilled workmen. And so he's hiring brothers and sisters, brothers and fathers and generations. And this was a way for Michelangelo to do two things. To establish quality control, to make sure that he had contact and connections with all 300 people, because if he didn't control them, at least the father would control the son at work. And the other reason was labor stability, which was always uncertain in the Renaissance. And so this was a way of guaranteeing that the workforce showed up on a regular basis and would show up on time every single day to carry out the work. And for example, this is a farm outside of Fiesole where about a half dozen of these people lived together. So they'd go to work together, they'd check each other's work, and this is the way that Michelangelo, in a sense, micromanaged this very, very large and complex work operation. What struck me so much in studying this facet of Michelangelo was how much he was involved in and knowledgeable about the day-to-day business, the most mundane details of carrying out work, right down to going off to the quarries. He spent more than 3 years of his life selecting materials in the quarries to make sure he had the very best marble available, then supervising the transport of more than 3,000 blocks of marble 90 miles from the quarries to Florence. He was knowledgeable about the strength of rope. He could argue with carters. He knew how to hire a ship that was capable of carrying his blocks of marble, some of them weighing 8 to 12 tons, in order for them not to sink in the River Arno on their way up to Florence. This was a person who was able to think and move between the mundane and the sublime very, very easily, back and forth, working on the mundane details of everyday life, and at the same time thinking and creating the figures that we see now in the Medici Chapel. And one of the great advantages of this was that Michelangelo could speak the language of the workmen who worked for him. And so one of the things that struck me was how loyal much of this workforce was to Michelangelo at a time when labor stability was very unpredictable. So many of these people worked for Michelangelo for 10, 20, even 30 years. And some of them moved to Rome when he moved to Rome in 1534, which is unheard of in Italy. You never leave your home city, much less Florentines ever going to Rome. So Michelangelo knew the language of the workmen, and he could talk their language. And as a consequence, he got the very best out of them, because they felt that he was one of them. And here's one of these cases where marble quarrying and marble transport virtually hasn't changed until the 19th century. It was done exactly the same way until the invention of the wire saw and explosives. It's an extremely dangerous operation, bringing down the marble down the mountain, and you can tell something of the danger. These are rope burns in the rock itself. You can almost feel the tension on fingers. Many of these workmen lost their fingers, a lot of damage. A couple of workmen got killed. This is still a dangerous operation even today. Quarrying and moving, transporting heavy objects. About 2 people die every year up in the marble quarries of Italy, which are flourishing now because of the demand for marble. This is one of the paths that Michelangelo had to build in order to bring down these blocks of marble, because he would find the best marble, and the best marble wasn't in convenient locations. It was oftentimes high on the mountain. So he had to actually build the paths in order to bring down these blocks of marble. We now do this, of course, by trucks. These are trucks that have 22 gears, and they go very, very slowly, and sometimes they have to go backwards because then the paths down the mountain are so very, very narrow. And if you look carefully, you notice that there's just one wire holding on this gigantic block of marble. And this is because if the truck driver gets too close to the edge and the truck starts to go over, he can actually release the wire and let the marble go down the mountain without pulling over the truck. So this is one of the great dangers still taking place, even though we have introduced modern technology. So I was actually absolutely stunned by the degree to which Michelangelo involved himself in the day-to-day operation of the workers. And so that first book, I would say, was about Michelangelo's relationship with work and workers. His relations downward into society, into the people who actually carried out many of his projects under his direction and supervision. But in the course of doing that research on all those people, I became ever more aware of the larger world of Michelangelo. As many and good as his connections were downward into society, I became ever more aware of his relations upward into the world of power, prestige, and patronage. As I mentioned, Michelangelo's extensive correspondence mentions 1,100 people in his correspondence. It's a cross-section of 16th century society. He knew everybody, and many of these people are very, very, very important. And so I began to think about a complementary book about Michelangelo's patronage, his money, his power, his interest in prestige. But what was the idea that really gave me the impetus to write a biography was the awareness of how Michelangelo thought about himself. He believed he was from a noble family, that he was not just an artisan, but that he was an aristocrat. And he fundamentally believed that he had noble blood running through his veins, and that he had a serious purpose in life, to be an artist, to do things on earth, to enhance our lives. But the idea of being related to nobles, artists aren't related to nobles. They generally, in Renaissance society, came from the lowest class of manual laborers. Michelangelo resisted this all of his life, and he claimed that he really was an aristocrat. But that idea, the genealogy of, was Michelangelo an aristocrat? Was he really well born? We make fun of that in the New Yorker cartoon here. Because everybody in Italy in Renaissance claimed, oh, I'm a descendant of Caesar. I'm a descendant of the Trojans. Venus gave birth to my grandfather. Genealogy was a creative art in the Renaissance. And so the idea that Michelangelo was claiming to have an important heritage or lineage was very, very common, except that it was common among the upper classes, not so much among the lower classes. But this idea of kind of genealogical pretension is made fun of in the New Yorker cartoon, where the title is, You Could Be a Medici. And the Medici is like the most famous Florentine patrons of the Renaissance, a great family of Renaissance patrons. You too could be a Medici. If you trace back your lineage far enough, or down far enough, finally you'll get to Peggy, Vicky, Bob, and Haas on Long Island. Yeah, we're the Medici. The truth is, though, Michelangelo really was related to the Medici. Now, it was a distant relationship, but in the Renaissance, even a distant relationship mattered because people could call themselves related and call themselves cousins. And so the relationship here is to the Medici family through Michelangelo's grandmother, Bonda, is really the important person here. And she was a Rucellai. The Rucellai were one of the second or third most important families in Renaissance Florence. And yes, indeed, the relationship is rather far. You have to go back in time in order to find the connection over to the Medici family. But this would matter much less to the very, very important and powerful Medici family than it would to the Buonarroti. The Buonarroti can social climb by claiming relations with the Medici. And this is precisely what Michelangelo's father did for his son. Michelangelo's father, Ludovico Buonarroti, is exactly the same age as Lorenzo the Magnificent, the most famous of all the Renaissance patrons. Not only is they exactly the same age, but they could call, and they did call each other, cousins. Distant cousins. But this is precisely how the Medici maintained their power, was by doing favors for their distant family relations. This is how they maintained their political support in Florence. And so it was actually no big deal for Lorenzo the Magnificent to invite Michelangelo to live in the Medici household, which he did for 2 years. And living in the Medici household at the height of the Renaissance, among the smartest people in the world, among the greatest artists of the world, 2 years in the Medici household was better than 4 years at Harvard. So Michelangelo was actually not trained as an artist. He was trained to be something of a courtier. He was living among princes in the smartest and the most sophisticated household in Renaissance Italy. So he had the beginnings of a humanist education, unlike most other artists who really did not have an education at all. And just being exposed to those minds, it's sort of like the Great Lives series. Some of you read some of the books, but you don't read all of the books. And actually, if you just came to the lecture, you'd have a very good idea about a lot of books. So Michelangelo himself never really read Latin very well, and he certainly didn't read Greek. But being around people speaking about Plato and Aristotle, you can learn a lot, which is why people still go to college. Because our students don't read either. But there's a very different story told about Michelangelo's beginnings, and you might begin to wonder why we didn't know more about his beginnings before. Why not make this connection? The story is one of the most beloved stories of all, that one day Michelangelo was carving the head of a faun in the garden of Lorenzo de' Medici before he actually knew the great man. The great man came by one day and saw Michelangelo carving and said, well, yes, you're a child prodigy. Why don't you come live with me? Which, of course, if it happened now, Lorenzo de' Medici would go to jail for child molestation or something. But the truth is, even though in this 19th century sculpture, which sort of encapsulates that story, makes Michelangelo 7 or 8 years old, wouldn't you say? Well, when he was in the Medici household, he was 14 to 16. So about twice the age of this boy. 14 to 16 in the Renaissance was not a boy, not a prodigy. that's an adult. You're almost ready to be an adult and go out on your own at that age. So the story is a way to, I think, emphasize and heroize Michelangelo at a much later moment in his career when he had become a great artist. And like many of us, we tend to embellish our early lives. We perhaps suppress a lot more than we tell. And we only feature and tell things about our own lives that we really want people to know about. And Michelangelo is no different from the rest of us. So Michelangelo's relationships with Medici were extremely important because he stayed related to the Medici for 50 or more years. And everybody on this chart here that's circled in red became a patron of Michelangelo at one time or another, or through a long period of time. 7 different individuals, including 2 popes, a cardinal, the de facto ruler of Florence, and the Queen of France. This is not a small group of people, but what's even more surprising is in the Renaissance, patronage, no artist had patrons for 50 years. Hand to mouth was the way most Renaissance artists worked. You work from one patron to the next, from one project to the next, and you never know where your next meal is going to come from. The idea of guaranteed patronage, especially of this order, is just stunning. And what does it do? It gives Michelangelo a kind of very privileged position in society. It gives him the opportunity to do many of the great things we've admired, but he had an awful lot of background help to make it happen. For example, he went, in the 2 years he was in the Medici household, he was exactly the same age as these 2 people. And these 2 people grew up to become the first Florentine Pope and the second Florentine Pope. So the lesson to be learned is make sure you know who you're sitting next to. You never know who might be the next Pope. Be nice to them, because they might really help you out. And those 2 individuals employed Michelangelo for more than 20 years. And papal employment is really good because it's unlimited budget. So the apogee of the success, this sort of social success of Michelangelo and his family comes in the year 1515. Michelangelo has already carved the Pietà, the David. He's actually finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling. In 1515, his younger brother, Buonarrota, was elected to the highest government in Florence. And at that time, he was honored by Pope Leo X, who was the first Florentine Pope, to allow the Buonarroti family to attach the Medici coat of arms to the Buonarroti coat of arms, which is what's being celebrated in this fresco here. The man, here's Buonarrota holding the Buonarrota coat of arms, and here's the person adding the Medici pala, or ball, which is the Medici coat of arms. So on this plate, in the Casa Buonarroti, we have the coat of arms joined. The lower part is the Buonarroti, and the upper part is Pope Leo X, and this is the Medici part. So this was de facto acknowledgement on the part of the Medici that, in fact, these 2 families are related. But I'd like you to notice 2 very, very important things about this. The first is that the Buonarroti have a coat of arms. Only aristocrats have coats of arms. Artists never had coats of arms. Artists very rarely even had last names. Leonardo da Vinci. He does not have a last name. He's named after the town he's born in. He had no lineage. He could not claim to have a family. Michelangelo claimed to have a family that was 600 years old. In Italy, as was then true and is still true today, the older your family, the greater prestige you have in society. So the Buonarroti claimed to have a coat of arms and claimed to come from noble blood. The second point that's very important is that this honor that happened in 1515 is not because of Michelangelo. He is already a world-famous artist, but rather it's because of his brother, who was elected to the highest Florentine government position. And so one of the things I would say my biography has done is put the family back into Michelangelo's story, because there could hardly be a more important component to Michelangelo's life. He worked all of his life to the betterment of his family, to preserve and continue the family, which continued until the 19th century before it died out. But he did everything in his life largely to improve the condition of the family, to raise their stature in society, and to ensure their continuation both genetically and in terms of financial health. So Michelangelo's real interest here is much more family-oriented than we ever knew before. He was much closer to his family than we ever believed before. And even though, you know, the letters that survive are oftentimes contentious, this is very typical of Italy. Surely you have heard this. People screaming at each other on the street before they go off to have coffee together. The Italians let their emotions out very visibly, but they do not hold grudges and things. So sometimes when you read the letters, you get a very skewed idea of Michelangelo, the curmudgeon and the grumpiness. But he only writes letters when there are problems. He never writes home and says, oh, I'm painting the Sistine Chapel. I'm having such a good time. No, he writes about the complaints and the difficulties of painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or that his brother has threatened his father, which really angers Michelangelo, precisely because you do not threaten your father. So the family really is an incredibly important aspect of Michelangelo's success and a center part of his career ambition. And then we saw already that his father helped smooth his passage into the Medici household to begin with. So this is an extremely, extremely important part of Michelangelo's self-definition, you might say. But having said all that about the Medici and how important they were to the family success and to Michelangelo's possibilities and potential, why has it been so long? Why has it been in some way unknown? Why did it take me to write about it? There is a very good reason here. Michelangelo had 2 biographies written about him in his own lifetime. And the reason we don't know more about the Medici and how they helped him in his career is because Michelangelo did not say very much about them. Because by the time the biographies were written, Michelangelo is 75 years old. He's the most famous artist in the world. And looking back over your life or his life, he just doesn't feel that, well, yes, I learned a lot at Mary Washington, but do I attribute my entire success to my college professors? Who's ever given us credit for your success? For Michelangelo, it's not so much even that. It's more like, by then, every one of those Medici patrons I showed you is dead. And for Michelangelo living in Rome, Florence and that time of his life is psychologically, geographically, genetically very distant from him. He has other concerns and he has other ambitions. And he has an idea of himself that really, it's not that Medici made me, I made me. He really did make himself, ultimately. And so one can imagine a certain suppression of that earlier history in order to emphasize other things that were important to him. The things that I've been talking about, the family, his ambitions, his social and aristocratic position. Indeed, by the time those biographies were written, Michelangelo had been confirmed in the fact that he was related to one of the most ancient families in all of Italy, the Canossa, who owned much of northern Italy. And the Counts of Canossa go way back into the Middle Ages, one of the most antique families. We have the letter written in 1520 by the current Count of Canossa, written to Michelangelo, beginning, "My honored kinsman," and going on, stating that I have gone into the archives and established a connection between our 2 families, and I invite you to come visit the ancestral castles. And the ancestral castle of Canossa is now a ruin, but was a great magnificent building, one of many that the Canossa owned at the time. There could not have been a more important moment in Michelangelo's career than to recognize the fact that that family mythology, let's say, of growing up being noble was proven correct from 1520 on. Now, what's happened in the 19th century was the genealogy was proven to be a little shaky. And so, because it probably is not correct that Michelangelo is related to the Counts of Canossa, we dismissed it. And we never emphasized that that's a very important part of his life. But for Michelangelo, there could not have been a more important fact in his entire life. And not only that, he firmly believed it, and every one of his contemporaries firmly believed it. And it completely formed who he was and how he acted and how he behaved as an artist and what kind of behavior he demanded from patrons, even from the 9 popes that he worked for during the course of his life. So on the right-hand screen is a drawing that Michelangelo made for the current Count of Canossa, who is Alessandro of Canossa, Alexander of Canossa. And Michelangelo has drawn a kind of allegorical figure of the modern Alexander the Great to flatter his patron, his relative. And it's very, very faintly drawn, but on the top of this very fantastic helmet is a dog, cane in Italian, and in his mouth is a bone, ossa, canossa, and that canossa, the dog with a bone, is part of the Canossa coat of arms. So it's a very clever sort of emblematic play that celebrates and flatters the Count of Canossa. The truth is, we've had many, 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 many signs of Michelangelo's aristocratic bearing and his interest in his noble birth and how it has affected his art. They've been before us for all time, but it took sort of putting it all together to make a coherent picture out of it. The first and foremost thing I would point to is the fact that he was a poet. He was a major poet, one of the most important poets of the Renaissance. We have more than 300 poems of Michelangelo, and they are very learned poems, Petrarchan, Dantesque. This is what he learned in the Medici household, how to be a humanist poet. And the poetry is extremely beautiful. The handwriting is extremely beautiful. Very important poetry. Michelangelo was very self-conscious about his handwriting, very self-conscious about letter writing, like a good, educated individual should be, someone from an upper class. He wrote constantly. We have 900 letters to Michelangelo. We have 1,400 letters written to Michelangelo. Not enough people saved his letters. But 900 letters where he was extremely conscious of spelling and grammar and punctuation at a time when there were no really fixed rules. And then we have some wonderful responses of Michelangelo to his nephew in Florence. He wrote regularly to his nephew when Michelangelo had finally moved to Rome. His nephew, his father had died, and so Michelangelo was a surrogate father at a distance. And we had this letter from Michelangelo to his nephew Leonardo, but not the other Leonardo, the nephew Leonardo. Leonardo, you write like the biggest ass in the world. Until you learn how to write a letter, just don't bother. You give me a headache. Every time I get one of your letters, I get a headache. Now, that's the kind of letter that people have read for a long time, and we've known this letter for a long time, as an example of how Michelangelo couldn't get along with his family, how he was such a curmudgeon, how he's such antisocial. But Michelangelo is acting as the surrogate father. He's trying to serve as role model for his nephew. He's trying to teach his young nephew how to behave in Florentine Renaissance society as a proper young man. And you have to learn how to write a proper letter to do so. Then after that sort of education, perhaps the most important thing is marriage. Marry well into society. Marry upward into society. Well, Michelangelo never marries. But this is where his family becomes so terribly important. Both his nephew and his niece marry into very established, well-respected Florentine families. His nephew, Leonardo, marries a Ridolfi, and his niece marries a Guicciardini, which is a Florentine family whose palace still exists on the Oltre Arno in Florence, and is still one of those ancient Florentine families that's extraordinarily proud of its lineage, partly now because they married into the Buonarroti family and are related to Michelangelo. And then after marriage, wealth. And then in Renaissance Italy, the most secure means of establishing or gaining wealth was by investing in land, which was still true until a little while ago in America, right? Michelangelo, every time he was paid for any of his business, bought a new farm. And this is a map of all the properties, both in the city and around the city, that Michelangelo bought in the course of his career. And the farm provided both the goods of the farm, everything that was grown on the farm became Buonarroti property, but also the rental property, the rents that were paid by the farmers who managed his farms. And this is one of the many, many farms. This one is the one in the south of Arno. Some of them still exist. Some of them are still working farms. Very, very proud of their ancestry, going all the way back to being once owned by Michelangelo. By the time Michelangelo died, he was a multimillionaire. He didn't live like one. He lived very, very frugally. But if you take all of his landed investments, they were worth multi-millions. But this is the legacy he gave to his family. And this is how his family continued on in the next couple of centuries and how they continued to rise in their social station in Florence for the next couple of centuries. In the little town where Michelangelo grew up, in Settignano, which is just about 2 kilometers outside of Florence, in the hills of Florence, this is one of these towns of craftsmen, of stoneworkers, and still is today a kind of lower-class enclave of skilled workers. In a town of such very modest income, the Buonarroti house, which still exists, which is really a villa, had land that extended all the way down this hill, all the way to the Arno River. So the property has now shrunk, but the house still exists. But in comparison to anybody in this town, they were the patrician family, one of 2 major patrician families in Settignano. This is one of the ways Michelangelo was able to get his workers, because he grew up with these people, but he was of a different class, and they were very happy to go to work, for not only work for Michelangelo, not because he's a famous artist, but because he's working for the Pope, and so the guaranteed pay is very good. And like every patrician family, if you have property outside the city, you also had to have a presence in the city, because there's also business you have to do in town. And there are times in town where it's very important for the family to make a showing among the populace, among the social elite. And so it became very, very important for Michelangelo to invest in a house, to buy a house in Florence, which still exists, the Casa Buonarroti. Now, granted, this house is nowhere near the scale of the Medici or the Strozzi or the Rucellai. But no artist ever owned houses. No artist ever made enough money to own property. They almost always rented property. And so the idea of an artist buying a family property, a pretty prominent family property in Florence, was an extremely important moment for Michelangelo in his aspirations to social success. And you'll notice that very prominently at the corner of the house, displayed like an advertising neon sign, just like the Strozzi and like the Rucellai, this is the Buonarroti property. We have more portraits of Michelangelo than any other artist in the Renaissance. But you almost never see him portrayed as an artist. When I started studying the portraits, I began to notice that, no, he's not often shown as an artist, but he's very often shown in black. And my first thought was, aha, this is the melancholic Michelangelo who can't get along with anybody, the grumpy Michelangelo. No, no, no. Black was the most expensive cloth you could buy in Florence. Even when Michelangelo lived in Rome for the last 30 years of his life, he always bought Florentine cloth and had it shipped down to Rome. Every one of his clothes were made out of Florentine goods. Michelangelo didn't buy clothes. You had your clothes made. You had a tailor that made your clothes. Moreover, by 1550, black is, in fact, the style. It's the Spanish style, the kind of severe style that's being imported from Spain. And this is where Italy is trying to imitate the great international power of Spain. So Michelangelo was extremely conscious of his social position and of his clothes. At one point he went to Venice and he wrote home to family and said, I can't go out until my doublet has been made. He can't go out in public until he has a doublet made. Or on this portrait, which is on the left-hand side, perhaps the most important portrait of all of Michelangelo, because this is the portrait that Michelangelo himself chose to be the frontispiece and the only illustration in one of those lives that was written during his own lifetime by Ascanio Condivi. This came out in 1553. Michelangelo approved the life, and he chose this as his image for himself. And notice how Michelangelo is described. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine patrician, written in Latin. This is how Michelangelo wanted to be known. So to conclude my discussion for you, On the right-hand side is the story of Michelangelo that has been told over and over and over again. This is the magnificent artist who could do anything, who was able to transform marble into flesh. On the left-hand side is the story Michelangelo wanted to tell. He owned a horse from 1520 onward for the rest of his life. For the next 45 years of his life, he owned a horse. I think some of you know how much a horse costs to keep. And you have to have a house with a stable, and you have to have a stable hand to take care of the horse. And his favorite beret, that favorite hat that he writes about because he kept a record of every piece of clothing he ever had made, that beret cost the equivalent of one of his workers' entire year's salary. It was made out of nice Spanish felt. It was one of the few non-Florentine things he bought. So Michelangelo was extremely self-conscious about his position in society, about his self-portrayal, and this really is the story he wanted us to know about. He wanted to know that he had succeeded as an aristocrat. I'd like to think that my book, my biography, tells both stories. It's not that one is more right than the other. It's both stories that need to be told. Michelangelo, the fantastic artisan, and Michelangelo, the aristocrat. And why does this all matter? I think for two reasons. I'll give you two reasons to conclude with. The first is, I think, Michelangelo did more than any other artist in history to raise the stature of artists from being a craft to being a respected discipline, from artisan to aristocrat. But the second reason is, even 500 years later, the Pietà, the David, the Moses, the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment, St. Peter's, these are central monuments of Western civilization and of Western creativity, and they still matter to us. They still can inspire us and awe us, even 500 years later. As Johann Goethe said of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, until you have seen the Sistine Chapel, you can have no adequate conception of what humankind is capable of achieving. Thank you.
Questions for Professor Wallace?
It was my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Michelangelo either thought of himself more as a sculptor than a painter, or preferred it. Could you clarify that?
He did. Michelangelo signed, for half of his life, he signed himself Michelangelo Scultore. And he was really trained as a sculptor if he was trained in anything. Which makes all the more remarkable the fact that he had never painted a fresco before painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And he paints the greatest fresco of all time. But Michelangelo seems to do this over and over again. He was also not an architect, but he built St. Peter's. So Michelangelo was a sculptor. He was a painter. He was an architect. He was an extremely important poet. And he was the world's greatest engineer, or the Renaissance's great engineer. We always think that Leonardo was the great engineer of the Renaissance. Leonardo thought of a lot of things and did nothing. Michelangelo just did it. He accomplished things in engineering which would make your eyes pop out. All that marble being quarried and transported 90 miles from the quarries, nobody had done anything on that scale or that difficulty since the Romans 1,000 years before. He figured out the engineering to accomplish all of that. So yes, he really did think of himself as a sculptor first and foremost. On the other hand, halfway through his career, he stopped signing himself as an artisan altogether, and he signed himself Michelangelo Buonarroti, and then finally he tells his nephew, don't call me just Michelangelo, use our full family name, Michelangelo Buonarroti de Simone. You want to really impress upon the people that you come from an important family with a lineage. So even himself sort of eventually gave up the idea of his identity being a sculptor and more of an identity as an aristocrat.
Obviously, you described a man of great ambition who liked to acquire wealth and status. How did he see his art? Did he see himself as creating works that transcended his time, that he had a feeling that he was doing something for the ages or not?
I think that, I would like to think so. I think that would be a somewhat romantic vision. That would be sort of the Agony and the Ecstasy version of Michelangelo. The truth is, Renaissance artists worked really hard, and they didn't get paid very well. And so really what more stunning is the fact that Michelangelo was given opportunities to create fantastic things because of his connections. And for those things, he got paid extremely well, all of which are terribly unusual. How much he thought about his, let's say, his artistic legacy, I doubt on every single one of his objects. In fact, what we have are these incredibly poignant poems towards the end of his life about how he has wasted his life doing art. Art and life do not go well together, he writes. And what he really felt towards the end of his life, now granted, he lives 89 years, so he lives twice as long as anybody expects to live in the Renaissance. So he had a long time to think about dying, and he did it for a long time. And he wrote a lot about it, because he expected it for 50 years. But for him, what was most important was he thought that art was not helping his salvation, that it was in some ways not good for his soul, as he also writes in another poem. So for him, if you ask that question, I'd say he would probably answer that St. Peter's, the building of St. Peter's, was his salvation. That this was the thing he knew was going to last for all time. That he was doing this for the glory of God and the glory of all Christianity. And that this was the one thing he could do on earth that was worthwhile.
A question here in the back. Hello. I wonder, did you do any research about Michelangelo's sexuality? Because isn't it controversial whether he was homosexual or not?
Well, yeah. It's not controversial. It's pretty well known. Well, Florentine sexuality is pretty well known, too. There's been a wonderful research taking place about Michelangelo's time, and he fits perfectly this sort of model of Renaissance sexuality. And that is, the model is boys between the ages of about 10 and 20 oftentimes were the objects of affection and attention by older men between the ages of 20 and 30. And in fact, part of that object of affection is also educating the younger people, because not everybody went to school, and you oftentimes learn through mentors and tutors. And so between 10 and 20, you are sort of the object of attention of a group, oftentimes a group of older men, and it's not clandestine. And some of it is sexual, but not all of it. It's a matter of partly of education. Between the ages of 20 and 30, you are then doing the opposite. You are being mentoring of the younger, the next generation. By age 30, you're supposed to have become successful enough in a career to actually marry. But nobody in Florence is going to let you marry their daughter until you can provide for them. And that's the case. Many artists didn't make enough money to ever provide or get married, and it was very common for artists not to marry. So it was not uncommon that Michelangelo did not marry. And so it was also very common for people to, in a sense, go through stages of attraction in homosexuality and heterosexuality and do a little bit of all. The only problem, the only time you ever got in trouble was if you're violating the norm, so that if you're a 50-year-old man still paying attention to 10-year-olds, no. So that's the only, otherwise all kinds of sexuality was accepted. Much more so, much more true in Europe even still today.
Yes, what gave Michelangelo the driving force to do what he did in his lifetime?
It's an excellent question. If there's any driving force, it's his very, very profound Christianity. He was deeply, deeply, deeply religious. And much of his work is religious, although he also did pagan work, but most of that is from his early career when he was much affected by the Medici and that humanist sort of environment of Florence. But certainly towards the end of his career, the driving force behind him was his very, very profound belief in his own religion and in Christianity and his desire to save his soul in whatever manner he could.
I would like to speak to that. His early work, he took artistic license. David, as an adult, not the shepherd.
A lot of license, yes.
Mary holding her dead son being the same age. Obviously, that was controversial, but was because of his connection with these great families. Was that kind of the influence that allowed him to develop these kind of extra stuff?
It's a good point. We should put these two questions together because they complement each other very, very nicely. And you're both exactly right. I would have pointed out that Christianity is the largest driving force, but the other one that would answer your question is this incredible ambition. And the David is the perfect example of it. There is no more ambitious and somewhat unreasonable view of a tiny little shepherd boy, 17 foot high, completely naked. It does not really honestly make biblical sense. But Michelangelo had just come back from Rome. He's 21 years old. He has carved the Pietà. He has carved the Bacchus. He wants to come back to Florence and show the Florentines what he can do. So one of his very powerful driving ambitions early in life is just pure ambition to succeed, precisely because guess who else showed up in Florence in 1501? But he was already older and already much more better known than Michelangelo. And so Michelangelo had to do something really spectacular, and that other person was Leonardo da Vinci. So everybody was like, oh, Leonardo's back in town, yay. Nobody had ever heard of Michelangelo. Nobody in Florence ever cares about the Pietà. It's in Rome. Who cares about anything about Rome? And so Michelangelo's David is the most declarative statement of, I am the greatest sculptor of all time. There's no doubt about it.
How did they move the immense blocks down the land, into the river, up the river, which had much more water, admittedly, at the time, and then back on land into position?
Exactly right. That was the first book. I wouldn't want to send it to you because it's actually part of the biography as well. But I, too, am just astonished at what Michelangelo could do in terms of the engineering of moving marble blocks 90 miles from Carrara to Florence. And I've counted, and I've watched it, and I've watched the operation. I've spent a lot of times in the quarries. It's 8 different loadings and unloadings. That is sliding it down a mountain using ropes, which sometimes broke. 2 of his workers got killed in the quarries in the process of excavating these blocks. And yes, Michelangelo was upset that the worker was killed, but he was really upset that he lost the block of marble that slid down the mountain and shattered into 1,000,000 pieces because it represented 6 to 8 months of work, of quarrying. Then you have to load it onto an ox cart, and then you have to load it onto the ship, and the ship takes it down to Pisa, and you unload it in Pisa, you load it onto a barge and take it up the Arno River, but it can't go all the way to Florence. You have to unload it at Signa and put it back on a ox cart and drag it to Florence. It could be 6 to 12 months for a single block of marble to go the 90 miles from Carrara to Florence. And he figured out the logistics of every part of that. And yes, sometimes the Arno River is too low and the boats would not be able to float the marble blocks, especially 12-ton blocks. And much of his writing in letters is complaining. He says, damn, and he damns God. He says, will it never rain again?
Okay, question back here.
Was Michelangelo's status as such, or did it become as such, that these great families were interested in being related to him as well as he was interested in being related to them?
Excellent point. And yes, that's precisely what happens. Because eventually the Medici have as much interest in absorbing Michelangelo into their history as Michelangelo did not have as much interest in absorbing the Medici into his history. He eventually denies sort of his relations with the Medici. They get reduced to a few cute stories. But now, if you go to Florence, the Medici and Michelangelo are bound together as Gemini. And that's largely Medici mythology that's grown up over time, because really Michelangelo is Florence. He is the representative artist of Florence, and the Medici can claim to have sponsored him and to have acknowledged him as the first to acknowledge him as an artist. And so you raise an extremely interesting point that, in fact, it gets reversed. That Michelangelo, the unknown artist, becomes very famous, and then the somewhat famous family wants to incorporate Michelangelo into their own history and mythology, and that has happened.
Time for a couple more. Do you have a question there? Okay, one over here.
Was Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel done solely by him?
My very first article was Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel done solely by him. My very first article was on the 13 assistants that we know and can document that helped him in the Sistine Chapel. And when I wrote that little article, you would have thought I'd never get tenure, because a London newspaper, The Observer, picked up this article, and of course they summarize it to make it more interesting for their reading public. American scholar says Michelangelo didn't paint the Sistine. Which is exactly not what I said. All I said was that he had 13 people helping him in the Sistine, because to undertake fresco, he's painting 65 feet on a ceiling. He has to draw cartoons. You have to mix plaster every single day. You have to trim brushes. You have to mix pigments. You have to carry water up 65 feet of ladders. You have to draw those cartoons out. You have to put them up against the plaster. And 40% of the Sistine is architecture, architectural decoration. There are thousands of acorns up there. Somebody painted nothing but acorns. And Michelangelo didn't paint acorns. Michelangelo reserved all the most important figures for himself. Did he have help up there, even painting? Yes. Can you, up close, tell that sometimes some minor figures are by somebody else? Yes. Does it matter? No. Those 13 people. And so when the story grew up, that Michelangelo painted the Sistine all by himself, and he did dismiss some of those assistants, and he decided he didn't need that much help. He got rid of some of them. And that became kind of the story, that he dismissed them all, but not by any means. But when Vasari and his biographers say that Michelangelo painted the ceiling all by himself, what they're doing is trying to celebrate a work of art that's so astonishing that we can't get our heads around it. And it doesn't really help to understand it better to think that he had a little bit of help, because really he designed, like in the chapel, he designed everything. And he did all the most important parts of it.
Well, you have a question, Kelly? Anybody over there? All right, one more. Last question. Wait, take
Ask question.
I was wondering, could you just briefly mention how the documentation survived from the past, those 1,100 letters, for example?
1,400 letters.
1,400 letters. I was just...
So what is the documentation on Michelangelo? He's the best documented artist before the 19th century. So we have more information about Michelangelo. I mean, after all, 2 biographies are written in his own lifetime, which is unheard of. People started talking about Michelangelo in his own lifetime. There's a tremendous amount of material around him, of people discussing him. He becomes part of the theoretical literature about who an artist is or what an artist is, as well as all of these letters. I only mentioned the letters between him and his correspondence, but there's another whole correspondence of his family members writing to each other. So they're not necessarily ever mentioning Michelangelo, but there's a huge correspondence among his 5 brothers and his father. And sometimes they mention Michelangelo. Oh, I hear that Michelangelo's off in the quarries. Is he safe? Is God with him? That'll be the only thing they say. But if we read those letters, we begin to realize the intense, interconnections among all these family members, and how closely knit they really were, and how they really did depend upon one another. Michelangelo, after all, financially supported his entire family, because none of his brothers were ever as successful as he was, except for his younger brother, who was actually extremely successful in politics, and he was the one who was elected in 1515. So there's a tremendous amount of material, and I wasn't joking when I said the Italians haven't thrown paper away. There's probably more to be found out about Michelangelo, but there's so much that really one can get a very, very rich sense of a person when we're working in a time when documentation is, for the most part, comparatively, unbelievably scanty. Thank you all very much for excellent questions.
I was just going to say, before before we say our final good night to Professor Wallace, I want to remind you that Thursday is our last lecture of the spring series. It should be a very interesting one. Nancy Agony will explore the relationship between mental illness and the greatness of some of the figures that we've looked at this semester. Abraham Lincoln for one, Winston Churchill for another. It's a pretty fascinating book, and I'm sure it'll be a very interesting lecture. Also, I think I mentioned once before that our founding patron, John Chappell, will be here, so it'll be nice if we can be here to express our appreciation to him. It's good for him to be coming down from Philadelphia for that last lecture. So it should be a good evening. As tonight has been, thanks to Professor Wallace. Thank you, sir.